Happy to have Pat Langley here today. He's the director of the Institute for the Study of Learning and Expertise and a research scientist at Stanford University. He's been involved with AI and cognitive science for more than 40 years, having published more than 300 papers and 5 books on the topics. He developed some of the first computational approaches to scientific knowledge discovery, and he was a very early champion of experimental studies of machine learning and its applications to real-world problems. He's a founding editor of 2 journals, Machine Learning in 1986 and Advances in Cognitive Systems in 2012. He's a fellow of both AAAI and the Cognitive Science Society. And Pat's going to talk to us today about the computational gauntlet of human-like learning. So Pat, take it away.
Well, Mike, before that, we're supposed to announce the future talks in the series. You want to do that?
Oh. Well, I guess that's my job. Yes, on January 13th, we'll have Jeff Kutchmer from UCSD, and on the 29th, Yuzhang Wang from University of California, Santa Barbara. Look forward to seeing you all there too.
Thanks. Okay, well, thank you for coming, everyone. And I want to thank my funders who let me spend time on what's effectively an extended critique of the field. I hope you'll find some interesting ideas here. So for those who don't know, machine learning had pretty modest origins within the AI community. When we launched the field in 1980, it was really an outlier. It was not widely accepted within AI, which wasn't very interested in issues like learning. That was at the time associated more with pattern recognition. But with the past few decades, it's come to play a dominant role in AI. And in particular, statistical induction on massive data sets has led to some very impressive results in the past 10 years in multiple areas, most notably computer vision, natural language, and gameplay, but there's plenty of others. The problem is that in the process, the field has lost both its intellectual diversity and its conceptual roots. And I'll explain what I mean by that as I go along. But the basic claim of this talk is that we can address both of those problems and, I hope, devise even more effective AI systems by focusing on learning like humans. Let me give you 2 examples. The first is learning in mathematics. So think about how students acquire mathematical knowledge in our educational system. They start by learning to recognize and write digits. Then having done that, they learn how to retrieve and use arithmetic tables. And only then do they start to master multi-column addition and subtraction, which gives a lot of kids a lot of problems. And having that expertise, they can then start to learn how to simplify complex fractions, how to solve algebraic equations and word problems, eventually getting to symbolic integration and so on. Now, this curriculum does take years, but it does not take thousands of instances per concept or skill. The trajectory of human learning in mathematics is drastically different from how we train machines these days. I don't think that's really debatable. Here's another example, possibly more timely, because there's a lot of work on self-driving vehicles now. But think about how people learn to drive, even teenagers. They first learn categories for things like roads and lanes, intersections and signs. Based on those, they can acquire skills for changing lanes, for passing, for turning, for parking. I actually failed parallel parking when I took my driving test in Texas at the age of 14, but I eventually got there. But you also learn social norms for driving, including not just laws, but customs. Anyone who comes from Pittsburgh knows about the Pittsburgh left turn, which is where when you come to a red light, you let if there's a person who wants to turn left on the other side, you let them go, even if there's no left turn lane. And it's a very, very strong custom. You will get honked at if you violate it. Um, but of course, mastering these abilities takes training and practice, but most drivers are pretty good after a short course. Now you could say, well, there's some transfer from other things like walk. Of course there is, but no, there's a lot of new stuff in driving, and people learn it very rapidly. Unlike modern statistical learners, people do not need millions of miles experience to acquire basic competence. Do we still have accidents? Yes, but we're really remarkably good at it. It's remarkable how few accidents there are given the complexity of driving. Now, let me review the history of machine learning just briefly for you, because some people think that it's a new thing, which it isn't. We founded the field as a self-aware community about 4 decades ago. Okay? It was a spin-off of mainstream AI. The first workshop we held at Carnegie Mellon in 1980. We launched the journal Machine Learning from UCI in 1986. We held the first refereed conference at the University of Michigan in 1988. The original focus was on acquiring symbolic structures. And I know that because I wrote the copy advertising the journal, and it was very clear about this. We were about learning symbolic structures and explicitly eschewed things like neural nets. There was a central concern of automating the creation of expert systems. Expert systems, knowledge-based systems, were very successful at the time. There was a lot of excitement. And some of us said, well, fine, but we don't want to build them by hand. We want to try and acquire them automatically. But there was also a strong subgroup of people, maybe a quarter to a third of the people involved in the early stages of the machine learning community, who were really concerned with modeling high-level learning in humans. And I don't mean learning to recognize objects. I mean things like learning in mathematics, or learning complex problem-solving abilities. So almost immediately, the machine learning paradigm, the one I just described, was successful. It led to demonstrations of new capabilities. And by the late 80s, there were deployed systems that were built using machine learning technology. Donald Mickey did a lot of the early work in this area, but if you want a review of that, Herb Simon and I have a CACM survey article in 1995 that reviews a bunch of the deployed systems. Now, during this period, links to cognitive psychology were important. I mean, not everyone did it. Not everyone tried to mimic how people learn, but everyone said, well, that's a fine idea, and they respected people who did. So the field evolved rapidly. By the mid-1990s, there were a number of important changes. First, we had redefined machine learning not as a class of, not around the kind of representations that were used, like say rules or decision trees, but rather as any computational system that improved performance from experience. And that meant that we broadened the field very consciously to include statistical methods from pattern recognition and neural networks. And we also started to adopt controlled experiments to evaluate systems. This was not a thing initially, right? Initially, people would run their programs on 30 examples, look at the output, say, see, it learned something cool, right? And we said, no, learning is improvement in performance. You have to measure performance on new test sets and so on. And the early applications of machine learning led to this offshoot discipline of data mining, which at least in the early days, I'd say was 75% machine learning people doing applied work. Now, I think these are all accurate. I played a role in all of these. To my chagrin, I was an early champion of experimental evaluation, but I never suggested that we have the kind of mindless bake-offs that have come to dominate the field. I also championed broadening the field to include neural networks, and never thought that that would take over so deeply, so widely, that it would lock out more other approaches, but it has. Each of these steps along the way seemed very positive. We did them for a reason, but they also took the field farther from its psychological origins. And the results with deep neural networks over the past 10 years, as impressive as they've been, have just worsened that situation. We've gotten farther and farther away from the field's original vision and a lot of its original insights. So if we want to develop AI systems that learn like people, we're going to first have to identify what the core features of human learning are, right? What do we care about? And I'm talking here not about detailed models that fit specific experimental results. There's plenty of results. If you go to the Cognitive Science Conference, you'll see papers on models of human learning that fit reaction time data or error rates and so on. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about high-level regularities that cut across human cognition. These are recurring phenomena that hold in many settings. They're really what in Newell and Simon's 1976 Turing Award article, they talk about laws of qualitative structure. This is where they introduce the physical symbol system hypothesis and the heuristic search hypothesis. I'm talking about things at that level. These are going to be qualitative, but they're going to be pervasive. So insights about why is this useful? Because once you have this list of characteristics of human learning, those can serve as strong constraints on how you design and build your systems. But how can we use those constraints effectively? For example, to measure progress, which has certainly been a thing in the field for a long time. Well, I'm going to propose a computational gauntlet. Just so you know, this talk is an expansion of my my Blue Sky talk at AAAI earlier this year. And when I submitted it, one of the reviewers thought that I was talking about throwing down the gauntlet. Apparently, there's two word senses there. That has a different origin from this sense. This here, I'm talking about a gauntlet. It's a passage that's lined with armed adversaries. You have to go through that, and they try and hit you with clubs and knock you out and possibly kill you. This was used by both Europeans and Native Americans, and it's, I think, a powerful image to imagine an AI system to have to run a gauntlet like this. So what would a computational gauntlet be? Well, it would have constraints, the characteristics of human learning. Each of those is a constraint. It's like a club that will hit the system as it goes through. And to reach the end, to get all the way through, you have to pass each of those hurdles and get out the other end. This is not performance-oriented bake-offs. I'm not against those. I think they still have, well, I am against bake-offs. I'm not against doing quantitative measures of the performance expertise. That's still useful. I know I have many criticisms about the way it's normally done, but this is a different thing. This is before that. This is saying if you can't at least get through most of this gauntlet, then what in the world are you doing? So let me now go into the details of what some of these constraints might be. And you may have your own, and I'd love to hear if you think that I've missed any, but I think the ones that I'm going to present are pretty compelling. First, the first one is not about learning itself, but about what is learned. And it's the key claim is that learning involves the acquisition of modular cognitive structures. That is, you don't learn one big thing, right? You learn a bunch of elements. These are discrete elements. Now, it doesn't say what form they take. There are many theories in cognitive psychology about what those might be: concepts, production rules, cases, chunks. If you're a behaviorist, even stimulus response pairs count. Okay, so this is not a cognitive versus behaviorist kind of position. There's general agreement in psychology that people learn these modular structures. And that's very different from the idea that learning produces some large-scale monolithic structure. Whether it's a deep neural network or whether it's and so that's a big contrast. A related one is that, and it's enabled by the first, is that learned cognitive structures can be composed during performance, that is at runtime. So when you come to a new task and you're going to use learned expertise, you access just the elements that you need from long-term memory, and you combine them as needed to produce behavior. Now, this is not quite the same as well. Okay, here's a few examples. Production systems, which are still one of the dominant ways of modeling high-level human cognition, logic programs, and even generative grammars. They all have composable elements, and when you come to a new problem, you use the elements that you need, and the rest don't even get access, or they get ignored. So this idea of learning modular elements that are composed during performance, that is when learning is not active, that's very different from learning large structures like neural networks, which are, of course, the dominant methods these days. Now, let me be clear. Obviously, neural networks and decision trees are made up of modular elements, but they are not composed at runtime, right? They are built. You could claim that that neural networks, the activation levels are propagated through, and there's a kind of composition going on, but it's certainly not like many of these other classic approaches. And of course, within the neural net community, there's big concern about getting composability, where there are plenty of other frameworks that give you composability as part of their basic assumption. Third, now we're talking about learning. Acquire expertise in a piecemeal manner, one element at a time. Okay, so this makes sense. I mean, this is possible because we have modular representations of expertise. And so humans learn one cognitive structure, then another, and they keep doing that until they achieve broad coverage. Doesn't mean they necessarily have it right. They may have to learn an element again, say to fix it better in memory to make it easier to access. But generally speaking, this is how the education system works, right? You teach someone something and then you teach them something else. And the idea that that one thing would interfere catastrophically with something you just learned, certainly there is interference in human learning, but it's nothing like what we find in some of the popular methods. You see this in mathematics, you see this in driving. People do not create complex models en masse, right? Which is certainly the default for most work on this. This is on statistical induction. I'm having trouble with S's today. I don't know why. Fourth, incremental learning. This is not about the way in which the knowledge, this is not about the knowledge elements. This is about how you handle training cases. This says that learning processes one experience at a time. And I maybe should have made this explicit. And you don't go back and reprocess it later a lot, okay? Maybe occasionally you'll retrieve something, but no, basically we take things as they come and we learn from them. This is closely linked to online approaches that interleave learning tightly with performance mechanisms. In psychology, you wouldn't make that distinction. I mean, incremental learning and online learning are pretty much the same thing. So for example, people process the training events from mathematics and driving in an ongoing stream, not all at once. You do find this in much of the work on reinforcement learning. You do find it in work on mining data streams, but it's certainly not the default way that machine learning researchers operate these days. Just to be clear, incremental learning and piecemeal learning can occur together, but they're really orthogonal. For example, if you look at how methods for rule induction work or decision tree induction, they add one piece at a time, as they say, build a decision tree going downward. But processing, at least for most of them, but processing is batch or non-incremental. So I think it is a useful distinction, but they are often come together. Fifth is that learning is guided by prior knowledge. And I'm talking here about how later learning builds on earlier learning. Okay, I'm not talking about giving a system a bunch of knowledge to begin with and then using that to constrain learning. That's important and valuable too. We'll see some examples of it later. But here the key idea is that the system, because it's learning incrementally in a piecemeal way, whenever it does new learning, that's always influenced by, or it can be influenced by, aided by what's been learned before. So for example, complex skills in both mathematics and driving build on simpler ones in a cumulative way. And so you learn the simpler stuff first, and then you learn the more complex stuff. So this role of background knowledge, of learned background knowledge, is central to human behavior, but it really doesn't get much attention in the data intensive statistical paradigms. You will find quite a bit of interest these days in transfer, what is incorrectly called transfer learning, which is an oxymoron, but work on transfer where you learn and then you use that to influence future learning. And that's valuable, but mostly the way it's used with, for example, deep neural networks is not at all like what we see in humans. And I'd be happy to talk about that if anyone wants to debate it. Okay, now you bring all these things together and you end up with rapid acquisition of knowledge. It's innate. This is so we look at, if we look at the rates of learning in humans, it's pretty impressive. This goes back to why Chomsky was so big on saying that we have these innate language constraints. He was impressed with how rapidly the children seem to acquire grammar. And so now, just to be clear again, I'm not saying all expertise comes from a few training cases. That's obviously not true. But that we learn modular elements along the way in a piecemeal manner, and that each of those is acquired very rapidly and then integrated with what we already have. Human learning curves in mathematics and driving in many domains. This is where you plot performance against the number of training cases. They're very steep. And that's just not what you usually see with statistical induction, which almost brags about how many training, that they require millions or billions of training cases. I've never thought that was something to be proud of. And there is growing recognition that this is an issue, to be fair, okay, but there's still plenty of counterexamples. So when I submitted this paper to AAAI, the reviews came back, and I took the 4 most interesting criticisms of my points here, and I'm going to go over them briefly and give you my response. The first was, well, why should we be changing paradigms when deep learning works so very well? And the answer is, well, it doesn't work well, not by classic definitions of machine learning. Okay, it is not, and it's just generally acknowledged, it's not as data efficient as human learners. And even if it were just as good, look, if you're not doing science, even if you're doing engineering and don't want to understand basic scientific principles or something, it's a good idea to understand the entire space of techniques available, because you might come to some new problem where your favorite method doesn't work and you want to try something else. So let's explore the space of machine learning methods. Let's not focus too much on one. But in fact, deep learning is not as data efficient, and we, in principle, could do better by looking at how humans learn. Another, and this really annoyed me, it's like, why should we build AI systems that learn like people? And they threw out the classic example of, well, planes don't fly like birds, so why should we build AI systems that learn like people? And I've never liked that argument. Look, birds offer many insights into the nature of flight. The same laws of lift, thrust, and drag apply to birds as apply to airplanes. And understanding those is important in designing and building airplanes. And beyond that, I mean, the reason why there were efforts to build planes that flew like birds, but we didn't have the materials or the energy sources to do it at the time. Over 100 years ago, it was just not ready. But now we have small drones, tiny drones that flap wings like birds or insects. So this is just a spurious argument. Looking at natural systems is always a good idea. In fact, there's a big movement in the design community on what's called biologically inspired design that looks for ideas, design at natural systems. It's a good idea. Now, some people, one reviewer said, am I really talking about structure learning versus parameter estimation? Because of course, the kinds of story I was telling seemed to be mostly about learning new structures. And not so much about estimating parameters. But that's really not fair, because there are plenty of examples where neural network techniques are used for tasks that at least appear to involve structure, right? They may tackle it in terms of a parameter estimation framework, but no, I don't think that's really right. I do think that there are tasks, you can design tasks that only require parameter estimation. And there are tasks that effectively require some kind of structure learning. And the claim is that human learners or human-like learners are going to do better on those. That's the intuition. And let me make another point too. I know that I have been picking a lot on deep neural networks, but that's mostly because they're so bloody popular. I have all of the critiques I'm giving apply to random forests too, and other methods that have been around and popular for over 30 years. That this issue started to arise in the mid-90s with the data mining movement and the original big data craze. And so it's not about deep neural nets, although they are natural whipping. It's a broader issue than that. And then the last was, am I saying that human learning never involves statistics? No, of course not. The claim is that the rapid acquisition of new structures, very rapid, is a distinctive feature of human learning. People also learn statistically. They follow the laws of behaviorism that Skinner and friends laid out. It's not that we don't do that kind of unconscious statistical background learning. The power law of learning says that people keep getting faster on tasks indefinitely, right? But it's very, 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 very slow. It's that what's interesting about human cognition and human learning is this rapid acquisition of new structures, and we should be spending time paying attention to that. All right. This would be a good time to take questions if anyone has it. I'm about to go into those. Are there any, or am I doing okay?
Quick question. I mean, I guess I'm just trying to understand maybe the argument here, and it feels more like not necessarily to say that people can't keep studying deep learning. You're not prescribing what everyone needs to research, but making a case for a different focus of research for a community. And so is that a correct characterization?
Well, yes, of course. As I said at the beginning of the talk, the biggest problem we've had is we've lost the intellectual diversity of the field. And so you can view this as a sort of a DEI talk on the intellectual content of machine learning research. That there were and I'll give you some examples of work that is the kind of stuff that I would like to see. And I'm saying not that people shouldn't be doing stuff on random forests or deep neural nets, but that we shouldn't abandon this entire powerful paradigm that was very successful and still has lots of legs. That's my position. It's particularly frustrating to me because when I was editing the journal Machine Learning back in the late 80s, I was one of the champions of broadening the field to redefine it as any computational system that improves performance with experience, including neural nets, which we had originally excluded from the field, from the community. And I said, no, that can't be right. So fine. So why can't people who work on deep neural networks say, and they don't, most of them really don't, say, well, maybe we should be looking at some of these other approaches too, because there's room for all. Come on in, the water's fine. But that's not the attitude that you see. So that's what I'm pushing for.
So Pat, it seems like you have no one to blame but yourself then for this.
I think that it was a lot of guilt about this, but I think it probably would have happened eventually anyway. So yeah, it's I think it was if you're interested in, I have a longer separate talk about the evolution of machine learning as a field and how it went, each step along the way looked fine at the time and then led it apparently inevitably to where we are now. But it's not as it's even more of a critique of the field than this one is, and this is at least has a vision about what we should be doing. So I decided to give this talk because I thought it would be more interesting for people. I have an editorial in Machine Learning from 2011 that reviews the first 25 years of the journal and how the field changes. And I do talk about some of these things here. And yes, I'm partially to blame. Anyone else? Okay, let me give you some examples, lest you think that I'm just waving my hands and think that we need to do new things. No, I'm going to give you some examples of what some alternatives are. And I'm going to pick 4 examples, 2 older systems, 2 more recent systems, Fisher's Cobweb, Minton's Prodigy, McClure et al.'s SAGE, and Muggleton et al.'s Meta-Interpretive Learning, to show you some examples of systems that do run the gauntlet successfully. And I think they offer useful role models. Let me start with Cobweb because I think it is a very interesting system that is been underrepresented, not quite forgotten, as I'll tell you in a second. This was Doug Fisher's thesis at UCI when Mike and I were professors there. And Cobweb was a computational model of human categorization and category learning that constructs a taxonomic hierarchy of probabilistic concept descriptions. Terminal nodes in this taxonomy were specific training cases that the system has seen. Non-terminals were probabilistic summaries of everything below them. Okay, the performance system would take a new case, it would sort it down through the hierarchy, guided by an evaluation function called category utility. It was an information theoretic function that tried to trade off what was called predictiveness and predictability. The system would halt at some point, sometimes by reaching a terminal node, sometimes halting midway down. And whatever it halted, it would use a selected concept to predict any missing values. So this was a kind of pattern completion framework. So Cobweb was perhaps most interesting because it gave a theoretical unification of ideas from decision trees, from naive Bayesian classifiers, and nearest neighbor. Right? Each node in the hierarchy was sort of like a naive Bayesian classifier, but it was organized like a sort of multivariate decision tree, and internal nodes were stored training cases. So you could view the taxonomy as a way of indexing those training cases, although sometimes you would use generalizations to make predictions. And cobweb reproduced some well-known psychological phenomena like basic level categories and typicality effects. So let's talk about learning. Cobweb is inherently incremental. It interleaves the learning process with categorization. It worked on unsupervised data. Each time a training case came through, it would sort it down through memory. It would update the probability distribution for the concepts through which it passes. If it reached terminal node, it would then extend the taxonomy downward. It would create a probabilistic summary of the terminal node and the new training case that would become their joint parent. It would add, if it got to a node and none of the children were especially similar to the training case, then it would create a new branch. And it would sometimes merge or split a node's children if that would improve category utility. It learned categories very rapidly in an incremental, piecemeal way that builds on prior acquisitions, which of course is part of the Gauntlet features that I mentioned earlier. Perhaps most interesting for modern day machine learning researchers is that each cobweb training case led to both the creation of a new cognitive structures, one new cognitive structure, and revision of statistical summaries. So just to be clear, acquiring new structures in a piecemeal, incremental way and updating probabilities or statistics, they're not mutually exclusive. Cobweb brought them together in a very interesting way. This is what a cobweb hierarchy looks like. It's very simple. You see the terminal nodes. There's a set of attributes and possible values. These are like truth tables with probabilities. And of course, these terminal nodes, because they're in training cases, only have probabilities of 1 for the values observed, whereas the non-terminals have flatter distributions and so on. This is what category utility looks like, and I won't spend time to go over it. And here are some learning curves from the classic congressional voting records and soybean data. And just look, if you look at the rates of learning, I mean, these are rapid. This is a comparison between cobweb and a descendant system called Arachne that in these cases did very similarly. Now, cobweb originally focused on tabular, what's now called tabular representations like this. But Chris McClellan has recently done some extensions to it. He has a convolutional version of cobweb that processes images. And recently we co-published a paper on a version that takes takes sequential data like you find in word sequences, and it uses context to build a hierarchy. So it's trying to reproduce some of the ideas in Word2Vec. So those ideas, using context and doing convolutional processing, of course, they have nothing to do with deep neural nets. They are general techniques that you can combine with a system like cobweb. Okay, let me talk about Prodigy, because I know that there are some Prodigy fans in the audience. There's a number of senior people who at ISI who did their dissertations at CMU within the Prodigy framework. And it was an architecture for knowledge-based planning that encodes, as all planners do, it has domain operators, but it also had domain-specific control rules that let it select or reject goals, operators, or operator bindings. It used means-ends analysis to carry out goal-directed search through a space of problem decompositions. It's not usually cast that way, but I think effectively that's what's going on. And it would use the control rules to reduce search, either by blocking poor choices, favoring good ones, and there was also the option of preferring one over another. Prodigy's use of means-ends analysis is consistent with what we've seen in studies of human learning, of human problem solving. And I would say at a high level, Prodigy was exciting at the time because it brought together 4 key ideas in AI: reasoning, heuristic search, the role of knowledge, and the acquisition of knowledge from experience. Prodigy learns about planning from traces of its own search processes. It used a generic theory of problem solving to explain why each choice led to success or failure. It compiled each explanation to a control rule for selecting and rejecting the goals, operators, or bindings. But Steve Minton, in his early work in Prodigy, discovered that wasn't enough, that he discovered something he called the utility problem, where the system was learning control rules and they actually were reducing search substantially, but the cost of using those rules was actually more than they were worth. And so he called this a utility problem, and he, to fix it, started to collect statistics on whether the rules were actually useful. And he would throw away the ones that were more trouble than they were worth. There were some impressive results in search reduction and CPU time on problems in many domains. And I'd say that the most interesting lesson Prodigy has for the modern era is that you can combine rapid generation of new structures using background knowledge, in this case, a theory of problem solving, with their gradual evaluation by statistics. And this is something that I keep trying to tell people, and most people don't get it. Statistics were invented not to generate hypotheses, but to test them. People don't generate hypotheses with statistics generally. Mostly we use a few examples and some background knowledge to come up with conjectures, and then some of them may not work out. That's why we use statistics. Prodigy brought those ideas together. This is still antithetical to what you find in the reinforcement learning community, and I think it's one of the reasons why their systems learn so very slowly. But again, this is not saying statistics have no role. It says that they have a supporting role, supporting the rapid generation of new structures. Here are some Prodigy control rules for selection and rejection. There's the utility criterion it used to decide which rules to keep. There are some, these are not learning curves, these are cumulative performance curves, but they show that the learned expertise is doing much better than if you don't have it. And there were many extensions and to Prodigy, including ones for planning by abstraction and logical problem solving, learning for plan quality rather than efficiency, and that's a subset of the things that were done. Sorry, I didn't give you the citation, Craig. Let me move on a little more quickly. A third system developed by McClure and Ken Forbes and their colleagues at Northwestern. It's called SAGE, and it acquires, this is a supervised learning system that acquires complex relational descriptions. It represents each concept as a set of relations that can share arguments across different relations, but each has an associated probability. So again, you see that we are not talking about something that gets rid of statistics entirely, but rather that it has a subordinate role. For each new training case, T, it uses structural analogy, kind of relational partial matching, to retrieve descriptions that are similar to it, and then it selects the best of the candidates, C. If the retrieved candidate and the training case, again, these are both relational descriptions. If they match well enough, then you use T to update the C's probabilities based on what did occur in T. And if there were things that were in T that were not in C, then you actually add new relations. If that doesn't work, if the match is not good, then you create a new disjunctive description based on T, and then that's available for future use. And SAGE published papers on learning geographical concepts, musical genres, object shapes. They all do far more rapidly than statistical techniques. And here's something pretty different, also working with relational representations, but in another way entirely. Muggleton and multiple colleagues at Imperial and UNSW and elsewhere have an approach to learning, an abductive approach to learning logic programs. They give the system domain-independent background knowledge, stated as rules. It's background knowledge. It's rules, but they don't refer to any domain predicates per se. Okay, they're more generic things. Similar, I think, to the theory of problem solving that you found in Prodigy. Given a new training case, they search for the simplest explanation they can find. And they're searching through a space of proof trees, but they're using abduction, so they can introduce default assumptions in order to complete things. But they prefer simpler ones. And along the way, these generic rules they have actually refer to they have predicates, they have variables in place of predicates. And so they can create new scolums for new predicate names. And those can get reused later in the same explanation. And then once they've found an explanation, they transform it into domain rules for later use and so on. They've shown some very impressive results on visual concepts and on control programs, again, learning much more rapidly than the mainstream stuff. What's most interesting here is it shows that you can do representation learning in ways that have nothing to do with deep neural networks, right? There's a whole conference called on representation learning, but you won't find this kind of work represented there, and it should be. Okay. So just to summarize how these systems compare.
Pat, I'm just going to let you know you've got about 12 minutes left before we end, but if you want to save time to questions, do so later on.
I will. Fine. So this is just a summary of how these systems fare along the characteristics of the computational gauntlet. And I've put deep neural networks here just as a straw man. I've tried to be generous to say, well, you could sort of argue it has composable elements in terms of the activations. There's certainly work on transfer that uses prior knowledge, but the other systems do much better. I'd say Cobweb and Sage do not really deal with composable elements. Prodigy and meta-interpretive learning did not really use acquired knowledge to aid future learning, but there's a but they all do well. Let me mention in passing 2 pieces of my own work, one on inductive process modeling, where our systems search a space of process models that compile into sets of differential equations to explain multivariate time series data. Like these data, this is a synthetic data from a 20 organism food chain, and our system is able to reconstruct the equations for this from about 100, maybe 150 observations. So that's, again, another example of this is not incremental, but otherwise it does very well on the gauntlet. And very recent work on learning what I call hierarchical problem networks. These are similar to hierarchical task networks, but the methods are indexed by goals, and there can be conditions to avoid goal interaction. And what's interesting here is that this is very similar in spirit to Prodigy, but it's not using classic explanation-based learning techniques or more recent techniques for inductive logic programming. Instead, uses domain constraints to identify conditions on things. So those are some pieces of my own work that also fall in. And you see, there's a lot of variety in this. Okay, there's not one way to do to satisfy the gauntlet, but they're very different in spirit from either things like decision tree induction, random forests, and deep neural nets. So suppose we want to foster work on human-like learning. What can we do? Well, we broaden our education to cover the classic methods. Okay, if you're teaching a course on machine learning or even machine learning, you're not talking about Prodigy or Cobweb, there's something wrong. We need to expand funding to support human-like approaches. There was such a thing in the UK recently, and then it led to a flurry of work on the topic. We need publication venues that value such work. You could publish in cognitive science. We probably could get into AI journal, but we need more. And I think most important, need to champion evaluation using computational gauntlets. We can't just keep doing these mindless bake-offs. We need to show that our systems act how they actually do on these, what Newell and Simon called laws of qualitative structure. So I think that this can help us create a new zeitgeist that recaptures the early spirit of AI and machine learning. And just to be clear, again, I'm not the only person saying this. There are a few other voices of the wilderness. Marcus and Davis have a paper that came out in 2021. Scott Fallman had an older one saying similar things, although not focusing specifically on machine learning. So machine learning, despite very impressive advances, has abandoned many of its early, most profound insights. And we should be developing at least some, more of us should be developing AI systems that learn by acquiring modular, composable structures in a piecemeal, incremental way, aided by knowledge from little data. That's a computational gauntlet, and I dare other audacious AI researchers to tackle it. Okay, questions?
Okay, any questions for Pat?
So, Pat, I have a comment. With respect to Prodigy, since the only circle that you didn't fully fill in was about process knowledge, I would point out that Yolanda's work on learning by experimentation actually did learn new process knowledge. She would learn new operations.
Oh, I do remember that, but that wasn't what I was talking about. I think what I was saying is that well, you're right. Okay, I said that prior learning influences later learning, and I know that so you may be right. That may be an example. Good.
So I'll start with a comment. I'm not sure things are quite as bad as you say. I mean, yeah, I'd like to see more people doing more work like me or you. But I mean, I'm still able to publish the work that I do. Yeah, I get critiqued by reviewers who don't understand the same context. I think one of the real issues that I've seen is though the complete absence of training in cognitive science for those in AI. It's just, tends not to be a requirement. I know I mentioned this in email, but even cognitive science students at UCSD didn't know where Q validity was, and never mind category utility and things like that. So I think it's important that we have this understanding of human learning and how it differs from some of our current methods, and try to make our methods more like it due to the advantages it has. I mean,
I agree with you, Mike, but I'm also concerned that I haven't been to the Cognitive Science Conference for a few years, but the last time I went, many of the papers that talked about learning or computational models of behavior in general had similar problems, that people did not know the classic literature. It's not just in AI circles, it's in cognitive science circles too. So yeah, I was at there was a Stanford event a few years ago, and there was some student who was excited that psychologists had discovered the approach to evaluation that was so popular in machine learning. And I had to tell him that in the late 80s, we lifted ideas from experimental psychology directly for use in machine learning, and people people have no sense of history at all. It's just amazing. Anyone else? I was hoping for some bitter arguments, but I guess ISI is generally friendly to this kind of stuff.
I'm friendly to the general line of thought, but I guess I have a different type of critique, and maybe also a couple of different types of critique. So first, I mean, the way you describe some of these Gauntlet, qualities, composable, you sat down, you read a paper and you said, oh, this one's composable, right? But it's sort of from a system design perspective, and sometimes these are not evaluated on each sort of component skill, or it's not clear how one would evaluate fairly across all the components.
I agree. I think that's a very good point. So I was doing a knee-jerk, like, obviously this system is using composable structures because that's how it works. But there's an empirical question. So there are plenty of people doing work on neural networks who are concerned about composability, and the system doesn't look like it's composable, but they're trying to get it to be. And so it's really an empirical question, and we need empirical measures for that. Whether or not that's if you have ideas on how to do that, I would be delighted to hear more. Not right now,
I don't,
but also.
but yeah, no,
So
I mean, it's a good
question.
question. Yeah. Well, I mean, that kind of leads to my second question, right? Like, if you think of the brain kind of biologically, there are people have seen different specializations in parts of the brain, but at the same time, the way it generally people perceive it is that a set of neurons, right? And the specialization of composability or learning from a few experiences, these sorts of artifacts that we see of human learning are not designed necessarily into the system, but are kind of self organizing, for lack, to pull a different kind of term, right? So if you kind of think of that, idea of, well, the specialization and the different sort of modules that develop in the brain occur kind of organically without a specific preordained, design in the system. How does that compare to kind of your perspective on deep learning today?
Well, it sounds like you're taking a reductionist position on how to do science, and I am not a fan of reductionism. If you look at the history of science, chemistry was developed on its own without looking much at physics. They didn't, quantum chemistry didn't come along until about 100 years ago, and it's still not very widely used in practical settings, right? Biology developed independently of chemistry. Eventually, they started to join forces. But so science works, at least effective science works by picking a level of description and collecting phenomena and building models at that level. And only later does it worry about how it might connect to other levels. So the idea that we're going to build a giant network and then just turn it loose, look well, no hands, right? I'm sorry, but I don't think that leads to deep insights into the nature of the mind. Now, other people obviously disagree, and the connectionist neural net community has always had a strong associationist, reductionist kind of bent to it. Whereas the tradition I come out of, the Newell Simon tradition, is very much not that. And so
yeah, so I guess maybe the question I'd ask is, you gave this great example of, okay, there's the stage at which we learn 3 times 5 and 2 times 3, these sorts of multiplication and arithmetic.
Yep.
And is there actually a good description from cognitive science, the change that occurs in the brain? And then can we use that as kind of the standard to say, well, actually, this is the module that appears, this is the type of composability, this is what, we should see evidence of in
I hear you, but
regimen.
I hear you. And there certainly are people who are doing brain imaging that are looking at things like that. In fact, the ACT-R community has done a lot of work trying to map aspects of the ACT-R cognitive architecture onto brain regions and so on. But AI and cognitive psychology, computational cognitive psychology, made vast strides without knowing very much about the brain. And there's still plenty of room to do more. We do not, just again, chemists made lots of progress and still make lots of progress without worrying about the quarks that are involved. I mean, do we really care? No, mostly not. There are some cases where you care about that kind of stuff, but we can, and again, if someone wants to go off and do brain science, by all means, go do it. But there's no evidence that we need to in order to make further progress. That's my position. Yeah, thanks. I see a question in the Don Rose asks whether we should have a machine learning Olympics. Well, I do hate competitions, and I think that they have caused they lead to generate a lot of energy among people, especially grad students. I think that they have. If you look at one example, look at what happened in the AI planning community when they launched the planning competition. It led to the dominance of one particular approach to planning and abandonment of almost all other approaches. And that's just not healthy. Again, it eliminates diversity, and that's not what you need to do good science as a community. So I'm not a big fan of Olympics. Someone else says, how would you experimentally test AI systems composable? Yes, I guess that was the question that got asked before. And the answer is, I think that we need to think about that. And I'm open to suggestions. Could the current trend toward explainable AI help move the field back toward modular structures? Well, I'll let Mike answer that since he recently gave a talk on that. It depends on how you define explainable AI, I guess. Mike, comment?
I'm a little troubled by when people call things human interpretable, and the only humans they think about are those with PhDs in electrical engineering. So I like explainable AI, but I've been trying to push that towards more human-like explanations, trying to get AI explain like people instead of trying to get people understand how AI does things.
Yeah. Yep. Well, we're on the same page. Anyway, so this is the first time I've given this expanded talk, and I thank you for listening, and feel free to share the link of the recording if you know people who might be open to some of the ideas. Again, I think that this is I'm not the only one who says this kind of stuff, but I don't know of anyone who has tried to put together a proposal quite like this. I agree that it could be strengthened by having more operational measures of how you do on the different Gauntlet characteristics, and there may be other characteristics too. I did not mention relational representations, which I think is central, because arguably things like neural networks for image processing and language processing are, in some ways you'd say, well, they don't use relational representations, but obviously they're getting at some relational aspects of these things. So I left that out because it's not clear to me that that is as crucial an issue and crucial an oversight. What I would be worried about trying to operationalize these things and getting say 5 or 6 measures, and then people doing bake-offs on those. I think that would not be wise. That would just be more of the same. So, okay.
Okay, well, I think we ought to wrap up now. Let me thank you very much. And people know how to find Pat if they have questions and they haven't signed up for his to chat with him later on. Thank you very much. All right, see you in an hour and a half, Pat.